Abigail Owens did not cry when her father's belt cracked across her back for the third time that morning. She bit down on her lip until she tasted copper, and she made herself a promise. This was the last time. The last time she would kneel. The last time she would bleed for a man who had never once called her anything but a burden. She didn't know yet that before the sun went down, a stranger on a black horse would ride into her life and change every single thing. If this story moves you, subscribe to this channel, follow Abigail's journey all the way to the end, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The summer of 1883 came down on the Montana Territory like a punishment from God. The grass burned gold along the ridgelines. The creek beds cracked. The air itself tasted like hot iron and cattle dust, and from the moment the sun climbed above the eastern hills, there was no relief, only the slow press of heat that squeezed the breath out of everything living. Abigail Owens had learned a long time ago not to complain about the heat. She had learned not to complain about much of anything. She was 23 years old. She had her mother's dark chestnut hair and her mother's wide brown eyes, and according to the women at the Creekside Baptist Church, she had her mother's unfortunate tendency toward stubbornness. Her mother had been dead for 9 years. Abigail thought about her every single day. She was in the kitchen when she heard the horses. 3 of them by the sound hooves, heavy on the packed dirt of the yard, moving slow and deliberate, the way men moved when they thought they owned something. She already knew who it was. She wiped her hands on her apron and didn't move from the stove. The front door opened without a knock. It never did. Her father didn't believe in knocking at his own door, and the men who rode with him had taken to treating the house the same way, like a barn, like a fixture, like something that existed only to be used. Abel Owens was a big man. He had been handsome once or so, people said. Now he was thick through the shoulders and red in the face, with hands that looked like they'd been carved out of old saddle leather. He came into the kitchen the way he came into most rooms, filling it up using all the air. "Jeremiah's coming for supper tonight," he said. He didn't look at her. He poured himself a cup of water from the pitcher and drank it standing at the counter with his back turned. "Make something decent for once." Abigail kept her voice steady. "I've got beans on and cornbread in the skillet." "He's not a field hand, Abigail. He's going to be your husband. Act like it." The word landed in the room like a stone dropped in still water. Abigail felt it ripple through her cold, despite the heat. "I haven't agreed to that," she said. Abel turned around slowly. He set the cup down on the counter with a click that was too careful, too controlled. That was how she always knew when he got quiet. When he got careful, that was worse than the shouting. "What did you say to me?" "I said I haven't agreed to marry Jeremiah Wilson." She kept her eyes on the skillet. Her hands were steady. She willed them to stay that way. "You told him something I didn't tell him. That's not the same as me agreeing." "You don't get to agree or disagree." His voice was flat. "You're my daughter. You'll do what I say you'll do when I say you'll do it. Mama didn't raise me to be bartered." She heard him move before she saw him. That's how it always went. She had developed a kind of second sense for it over the years, the way animals learn to track a predator by sound before sight. She turned, but not fast enough. His hand caught her across the cheek, open-palmed hard enough to knock her sideways into the counter. The skillet hit the floor. Cornbread scattered across the boards. Abigail pressed her hand to her face and said nothing. Her ear was ringing. She could taste blood at the corner of her mouth, where her teeth had caught the inside of her cheek. "Your mama," Abel said, breathing hard, "is dead. And you are still in my house eating my food, wearing clothes I paid for. You don't get opinions, girl. Opinions are for women who've earned something." He straightened the front of his shirt. "Clean that up and start again. Jeremiah comes at sundown." He walked out. The door didn't slam. It closed quiet, which was almost worse. Abigail stood still for a long moment. She was not going to cry. She had made herself that promise a long time ago, too. Crying was something that happened to her when she was a child. She was not a child anymore. She picked up the skillet. She picked up what cornbread she could. She started again. Jeremiah Wilson arrived at sundown exactly the way punctual men did when they wanted to prove something. He was 41 years old, which was nearly twice Abigail's age, and he had the particular manner of a man who had spent decades being told he was impressive. He wore a clean shirt. He combed his hair. He pulled out Abigail's chair at the table like a man performing a courtesy, and she sat down in it because there was no version of tonight where she didn't. "You look lovely, Abigail," he said, settling into the chair across from her. "Thank you, Mr. Wilson." "Jeremiah," he corrected. He smiled at her the way men smiled at things they had already decided they owned. "We're going to be family. No need for formality." Abel sat at the head of the table and poured whiskey for the two of them and nothing for Abigail and said, "She's been a little out of sorts today. Nerves probably. Brides get that way." "I'm not a bride yet," Abigail said. Both men looked at her. Jeremiah leaned back in his chair and tilted his head the way a man did when he was deciding whether to be amused or annoyed. He settled on amused, which in some ways was harder to bear. "Your daddy tells me you're a spirited girl," he said. "I don't mind a little spirit, so long as it's pointed in the right direction." "And what direction is that, Mr. Wilson?" "Toward home," he said simply. "Toward family. A woman with good sense knows where her best life is." Abigail looked at him for a long moment. She thought about her mother's locket, which she kept hidden in the floorboard beneath her bed, because her father had tried to sell it twice. She thought about the way her mother had hummed while she cooked low and quiet, like she was keeping a secret song alive inside her chest. She thought about the day her mother died, the silence after which had lasted 9 years and showed no signs of stopping. "My best life," Abigail said carefully, "is not something you get to define for me." The table went still. Abel set down his glass. "Abigail, you asked me to come to supper." She looked at Jeremiah steadily. "I came. You asked me to sit at this table. I'm sitting. But I will not sit here and let you talk about my future like I'm a parcel of land you've already bought because I haven't signed anything and I won't." Jeremiah looked at Abel. Abel looked at Abigail. The silence stretched out thin as wire. "Go to your room," her father said. "I'm 23 years old." "Go to your room," he said again, quieter, which meant she had exactly one more breath of warning before it became something else. She stood up from this table. She walked to her room. She sat on the edge of her bed in the dark and listened to the low rumble of the two men's voices through the wall, and she thought with total clarity, "I cannot stay here." It wasn't the first time she'd thought it. It was the first time it felt like a decision rather than a wish. She waited until the house went quiet. The moon was high when she pulled the floorboard up and took out the locket, the one thing of her mother's that was still hers. She wrapped it in a piece of cloth and put it in her coat pocket. She took the hunting knife from the hook beside the window. She took the small amount of money she'd saved, $3.40 coin by coin, over 2 years, and she knotted it into the corner of a handkerchief. She did not take much else. She had heard her father tell Jeremiah Wilson through the wall that the wedding would happen at the end of the month. 2 weeks. That was all the time she had, and she was not going to spend it waiting for something to rescue her. She went out the window. Not the door, the window the way she had practiced in her mind 100 times. The sill was warm from the day's heat. The yard was silver in the moonlight. She dropped to the ground, caught herself, and didn't look back. She walked north. She didn't know exactly what was north. She knew there was a town, Cutter's Creek, about 12 miles up the main road. She had been there twice in her life, both times with her father, both times not allowed to speak to anyone for long. She didn't have a plan beyond north and away, and don't stop. She was 2 miles out when she heard the horses behind her. She stepped off the road fast into the brush and crouched low. Her heart was slamming. She pressed herself against the ground and held her breath and listened. One horse. Moving at an easy walk, not a pursuit. She waited until the sound was almost on her, and then she looked. The rider was a stranger, that much she could see even in the dark. tall in the saddle, broad across the shoulders, moving with the loose-limbed ease of a man who'd spent more of his life on horseback than off it. He had a black horse dark enough to blend with the night. He wasn't looking for her. He was just riding. She should have stayed hidden. That's what sense would have said. But she thought about the 2 weeks. She thought about Jeremiah's smile. She thought about her father's hands. She stood up. The horse shied sideways. The man's hand went to his hip, fast, automatic, the way a man's hand went when he'd spent time in places where fast meant the difference between living and dying. He checked himself before he drew. "Easy," he said to the horse, and then lower to her. "Who's there?" "My name is Abigail Owens." Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "I'm not a threat, I'm walking to Cutter's Creek." The man looked at her for a moment without speaking. His face was in shadow under the brim of his hat, but she could see the line of his jaw, the set of his shoulders. He wasn't young, mid-30s maybe, and there was something worn about him the way good leather got worn, not broken, but lived in. "It's the middle of the night," he said. "Yes, sir." "And you're walking 12 miles alone?" "Yes, sir." "Yes." He was quiet again. She waited for him to tell her to go back where she came from. She waited for the knowing look, the particular expression men wore when they'd decided they understood a woman's situation better than she did. He didn't give her that look. "You running from something?" he asked. Direct. No judgment in it, just the question. She thought about lying. She was good at lying, she'd had to be. But something in the plainness of the question made her answer with the same plainness. "Yes." He looked at her for another long moment. Then he reached up and touched the brim of his hat. "Cole Zachary," he said. "I'm headed north. You want to ride, you're welcome to the saddle. I'll walk." "You don't have to do that." "No, ma'am." He was already stepping down from the horse. "But I'm going to." She didn't argue. Arguing would have cost her time she didn't have, and her feet already ached from the hard road, and the horse was warm and solid beneath her when she settled into the saddle. Cole Zachary walked beside her, leading the horse by the reins. And for a long stretch, neither of them spoke. She expected him to ask questions. He didn't. She expected him to fill the silence with himself the way men often did. He didn't do that either. After a while she said, "You always offer your horse to women you find standing in the road at midnight." "Can't say it's come up before," he said. She almost smiled. "Where are you headed in Cutter's Creek?" "Nowhere in particular," he said. "Just passing through." "From where?" He was quiet for a beat. "South of here." She understood from the way he said it that south of here was something he wasn't ready to put words to. She understood that kind of silence. She lived inside one herself. "There's a man," she said after a while. She didn't know why she was telling him. Maybe because it was dark, and dark made certain things easier. "My father's arranged for me to marry him. I don't want to marry him." "All right," Cole said. "No more than that. My father will come looking for me when he finds me gone. He'll probably have Jeremiah Wilson with him." She paused. "Jeremiah has money. And my father has—" She stopped. "My father has a way of making people agree with him." Cole looked up at her from the road. "How does he do that?" She touched the side of her face without thinking. The skin there was still tender. She lowered her hand. Cole saw it. She knew he did. He didn't say anything. But something shifted in the set of his jaw. "I'm not asking you for anything," she said quickly. I thought you should know, in case they catch up." "You're not asking me for anything," he said, "and I'm not making you any promises. But I'll tell you this, Miss Owens." He looked ahead up the dark line of the road. "A man who uses his hands on a woman to make her agree with him isn't a man I have much use for." She looked at him. "Most people around here seem to have plenty of use for him." "Most people around here," he said quietly, "aren't me." She didn't answer that. She held on to the saddle horn and looked at the dark road ahead, and for the first time in a long time, she let herself breathe, like she might actually reach the end of it. Cutter's Creek was still sleeping when they arrived. The buildings dark, the main street empty. The only sound, the creak of a sign swaying somewhere in the hot, breathless dark. Cole stopped in front of a place called Marner's Lodging House, a 2-story building with a lamp burning in the lower window. "Mrs. Marner runs a decent house," he said. "She's a fair woman. She'll give you a room without asking too many questions, long as you've got a little money." "I have $3.40, Abigail said. "That'll do." He held the stirrup while she climbed down. When she was standing in the dirt of the street, he handed her the reins, not to hold, just to have her hand on the horse's neck, for a moment, something solid. "You got a plan from here." "Not much of one," she admitted. "You need work." She looked at him. "Are you offering me some—" "No," he said. "But I know people who might. There's a woman called Ruth Packard runs the dry goods on the East End. She's been looking for help. Mention my name, she'll at least talk to you." Abigail studied him. "Why are you doing all this?" Cole Zachary looked at her for a long moment, and there was something in his face that she couldn't quite name. Not pity, not charity. Something older and quieter than either of those. "Because nobody did it for somebody I knew," he said. "And I've been sorry about that for a long time." He touched the brim of his hat. He took the reins back. He turned and walked the horse toward the livery at the end of the block. Abigail stood in the street and watched him go. She didn't know then what she would come to know later, that Cole Zachary carried a name in this territory that made certain men nervous, and that the particular quality of stillness he carried everywhere with him was the kind that came from having survived things most men hadn't. She didn't know that he had reasons of his own for being in Cutter's Creek, reasons that would soon tangle with hers in ways neither of them could have predicted. She knew only this: for the first time in 9 years, a man had spoken to her like she was worth something. She knocked on Mrs. Marner's door. When it opened, she squared her shoulders and said, "My name is Abigail Owens. I've come a long way tonight and I need a room. I can pay." The woman in the doorway, stout, sharp-eyed with silver hair pinned at the back of her neck, looked her over without apology. She saw the mark on Abigail's cheek. She saw the knife at her belt. She saw the way Abigail held herself, not broken, not trembling, just tired and honest about it. "You eat yet?" the woman said. "No, ma'am." "Come in then." She stepped aside. "Room's 2 bits a night. I'll put supper on. You can tell me as much or as little as you like. Either way's fine with me." Abigail stepped across the threshold. Behind her, somewhere on the dark street, she heard the sound of a horse moving away at a slow, easy walk. And she held her mother's locket through the cloth of her pocket, and she thought, this is not the end of something. This is where it starts. Mrs. Ruth Packard was not a woman who wasted time on pleasantries, and Abigail decided within the first 5 minutes of meeting her that this was one of the finest qualities a person could have. She was in her mid-50s, sharp as a new blade, with calloused hands, and a way of looking at people that made them feel like she was counting their teeth. She ran the dry goods store on the east end of Cutter's Creek with the efficiency of a woman who had learned early that sentiment didn't move inventory, and she had never once, in 22 years of business, allowed a man to tell her what her prices should be. Abigail showed up at her door at 7 in the morning with a bruise yellowing along her cheekbone, and $3.40, and the name Cole Zachary on her lips. Ruth looked at the bruise first, then at Abigail's eyes. Then she said, "You know how to count back change?" "Yes, ma'am." "You know how to lift a 50-pound sack of grain without dropping it on a customer's foot?" "I can learn." Ruth studied her for another beat. "Cole send you?" "He mentioned your name." "He mention anything else?" "No, ma'am. He's not a man who talks much." Something shifted in Ruth's expression. Not quite a smile, but close to the shape of one. "No, he is not," she said. "Come in. I'll show you where things are. You work hard and honest, I pay you fair. You cause me trouble, I'll know it before you do. We clear?" "Yes, ma'am." "Stop calling me ma'am. I'm Ruth." She turned and walked back into the store without waiting to see if Abigail followed. Abigail followed. She spent the first 3 days learning the store the way she'd learned everything in her life, by watching, by doing, by making mistakes quietly, and correcting them before anyone noticed. She learned which floorboard creaked near the counter. She learned that Ruth kept a loaded shotgun behind the flour sacks, and that this was not a secret Ruth bothered to keep. She learned that the town of Cutter's Creek was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, and most people had the decency to pretend they didn't. She learned on the third morning that Cole Zachary had not left town. She found out the way she found out most things in Cutter's Creek, from a customer talking without realizing they were being listened to. Two men at the counter buying tobacco, voices low, but not low enough. Saw Zachary at the saloon last night, thought he'd moved on. Nope, still here. Asked Jim Heller about buying that parcel of land out past the North Ridge. Zachary buying land in this territory. That's what Jim said. Abigail kept stacking tins on the shelf with her back turned and her face neutral. She didn't know what to do with the information. She filed it away the way she filed most things that confused her, carefully in a part of herself she'd return to later. She was 2 days away from returning to it when her father rode into town. She heard the horses before she saw them, and her body knew, before her mind did, that particular quality of dread that hit low in the stomach, that old animal warning. She was behind the counter when she looked up and saw Abel Owens ride past the front window with Jeremiah Wilson at his left and two of Jeremiah's hired men at his right, and every thought in her head went quiet except one. He found me faster than I thought. Ruth was in the back. Abigail didn't call for her. She ducked below the counter level, moving on instinct, and she held perfectly still and listened to the sound of the horses stopping. Listened to the sound of boots on packed dirt. Listened to her father's voice carrying through the front wall of the building, like it always had, big, confident, with that particular edge that said he'd already decided how this was going to go. Asking about a girl. Young woman, dark hair. She'd have come into town 2-3 days ago, going by the name Abigail. She couldn't hear the response. Someone on the street answering low. She's my daughter, her father's voice said. She's confused. I need to bring her home where she's safe. She heard that word safe, and she felt something cold and precise move through her. That word in her father's mouth had never once meant what it was supposed to mean. Ruth appeared in the doorway from the back room. She looked at Abigail crouched behind the counter, and her eyes moved to the window, and she didn't ask a single question. Back door, she said quietly. Now. Ruth, I didn't ask you to discuss it. Ruth was already moving, already putting herself between Abigail and the front of the store, already reaching smooth and unhurried for the shotgun behind the flour sacks. Go. Abigail went. She came out the back into the narrow alley between the buildings and pressed herself against the wall and breathed. She could hear her father working his way up the street, door to door, that same voice, that same story, my daughter confused, needs to come home. He was good at it. He had always been good at making himself sound like the reasonable one. She needed to move. She needed to think. She needed Miss Owens. She spun. Cole Zachary was standing 10 feet away in the alley, leaning against the opposite wall, with his arms crossed, like he'd been there for a while. His horse wasn't with him. He was just there. How long have you been standing there? She demanded. Long enough. He nodded toward the street. That your father? Yes. And the man with him? Jeremiah Wilson. She pressed her back to the wall. Cole, I don't have a plan here. I thought I had more time. Plans change, he said. He didn't look alarmed. He didn't look anything much, which was both maddening and steadying in equal measure. You want to run or you want to stand? She looked at him. What? Running keeps you running. Standing means this happens here today in front of the town. He watched her face. Your call, Abigail, not mine. She had not given him permission to use her first name. She noticed this. She also noticed that it was the first time in several days that anyone had said her name like it belonged to her rather than to someone else. If I run, she said slowly, he'll find me again. Probably. And if I stand, then it's done one way or the other. He uncrossed his arms. But you won't be standing alone. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the $3.40 she'd had when she arrived, now reduced to $2.80 after the first few nights at Mrs. Marner's. She thought about Ruth and her shotgun. She thought about her mother's locket warm against her chest. "I'll stand," she said. Cole nodded once, like this was the answer he'd expected. "Then let's not make him wait," he said. Abel Owens was coming out of the sheriff's office when he saw her. She watched his face move through surprise and into something harder, something that had always made her want to make herself smaller. She didn't make herself smaller. She stood on the main street of Cutter's Creek in the full morning sun, and she let him see her face, the bruise he'd put there, still visible a little yellow now at the edges, and she held her ground. Jeremiah Wilson saw her half a second after Abel did, and the look on his face was different, more calculating, more proprietary, like something he'd ordered had finally been delivered. Abel crossed the street in long strides, and the two hired men moved with him, and Abigail felt her heartbeat accelerate into something painful. But she didn't step back. Cole stepped up beside her. He didn't say anything. He just stood there, and the simple fact of another person standing next to her, choosing to stand next to her, did something to the structure of the moment that she couldn't entirely explain. Abel stopped 6 feet away. His eyes went from her to Cole and back to her, and she watched him make the assessment the way he always did, sizing, calculating, deciding how much force a situation was going to require. "Abigail," he said, low, controlled, his public voice. "It's time to come home." "I'm not coming home," she said. "You're making a scene." "You rode into a town asking strangers about your grown daughter," she said. "That's the scene, Daddy, not me." His jaw tightened. "You don't know what you're doing. You've got no money, no—" "She's got a job," Ruth Packard said, appearing from the doorway of the dry goods store, with her arms crossed, and no shotgun visible, which somehow made her more intimidating rather than less. "She works for me. She's paid fair. She's got a room, and she's got food, and she doesn't owe you an explanation." Abel looked at Ruth. Something moved behind his eyes. Ruth was a known figure in Cutter's Creek, had been for more than 2 decades, and he'd done enough business in this territory to know her name and her reputation. He recalibrated. Abigail watched him do it. Then Jeremiah stepped forward, and the calculation changed. "Abigail." His voice was smooth, patient, the voice he used when he wanted to sound reasonable. "Your father and I have an arrangement, a legal arrangement. You running off doesn't dissolve that." "I didn't sign anything," she said. "Your father signed on your behalf. You're his dependent. Legally?" "She's 23 years old," Cole said. It was the first thing he'd said since they'd come around the corner, and the quietness of it cut through the conversation like a blade through cloth. Jeremiah looked at him. Abel looked at him. The hired men looked at him and then looked at each other. "And you are," Jeremiah said. Cole let the silence sit for a breath. Cole Zachary. Something happened on Jeremiah Wilson's face. A shift fast, barely visible, but Abigail caught it. Recognition. And under the recognition, something that looked uncomfortably close to wariness. "I know that name," Jeremiah said carefully. "I know you do," Cole said. He didn't explain. He didn't elaborate. He just let that sit in the air between them, and Abigail watched Jeremiah do his own kind of recalibrating and come out the other side, looking less certain than he'd looked a minute ago. Abel Owens had not done any recalibrating. Abel had never in his life backed away from a confrontation because another man's name made him uneasy. He stepped forward past Jeremiah and pointed at Abigail with one thick finger. "You are my daughter," he said. "You will come home. You will marry the man I've chosen for you. And you will do it without another word of this foolishness, or so help me." "Or what?" Abigail said. The words came out before she fully chose them. She heard them in the air and felt the shock of them in her own chest, that she had said it here in the street in front of people where her father couldn't make it disappear. The silence that followed was absolute. Abel's face went the color of old brick. "What did you just say to me?" "I said, or what?" She was shaking. She could feel it in her hands and her knees, but her voice held. "You've been telling me what to do my whole life and using your fist to back it up when I said no, and I'm done. I'm done with it. You want to drag me home in front of all these people, you go ahead and try, but everyone here is going to see exactly what you are." A crowd had gathered. She hadn't noticed it happening, but it had the way crowds always gathered in small towns when something real was occurring in the street. Shopkeepers, townspeople, a pair of women who'd stopped with their baskets in hand and were watching with the particular stillness of people who recognized something important. Abel's hand came up. Not a pointing finger this time, a fist. Cole moved before the fist moved. He was between them in a single step inside Abel's reach, one hand catching the man's wrist, holding it in the air. Not violent, not dramatic, just stopped. Abel tried to pull back, and Cole didn't let him, and for a moment they were locked together in the street, and Abel Owens, who had spent 40 years being the biggest force in any room he walked into, looked into Cole Zachary's eyes and went very, very still. "No," Cole said, just the one word. Abel breathed hard through his nose, his free hand flexed. "You put your hand on her in front of this town." Cole said, his voice low enough that only the men within arm's reach could hear, "And there isn't a courtroom in this territory that'll see it your way, and I will make certain of it." He released the man's wrist and stepped back slow and deliberate. "Take your men and ride out Mr. Owens. Your daughter is a free woman of legal age. She doesn't need your permission to stand on a public street." The crowd around them was watching. Abel knew it. Jeremiah knew it. The whole ugly arithmetic of it played out on both their faces, the calculation of what it cost to push forward against what it cost to retreat. Jeremiah Wilson touched Abel's arm. "This isn't the time," Jeremiah said quietly. "We'll handle this properly." Abel looked at his daughter one last time. His eyes were hard and wet at the same time, which was the most frightening combination she had ever seen in them. "This isn't done," he said to her. "No," she agreed. "It isn't." He turned. He walked back to his horse. Jeremiah followed. The hired men followed Jeremiah. And the crowd on the street slowly resumed its motion, the way water filled the space a stone had displaced, and Cutter's Creek went back to its morning business like something enormous had just happened, and most people were quietly certain that it had. Ruth gave her the afternoon off. Not asked her, not suggested, told her in that direct way Ruth had that didn't invite debate. "Go sit somewhere quiet," she said. "Come back tomorrow with your head on straight." And she pressed a piece of cornbread into Abigail's hand and pointed her toward the door. Abigail ended up at the creek on the north end of town, not because she'd planned to go there, but because her feet needed to move, and moving north felt like the right direction. She sat on a rock at the water's edge and ate the cornbread and watched the water, which was low this time of year, and moved slow, and she let herself feel all the things she'd been holding in a locked room in her chest since she'd seen her father's horses through the window. She was still there when she heard footsteps. She didn't flinch. She knew the sound of the walk, that particular unhurried cadence. Cole sat down on a rock a few feet away and said nothing. He had a way of occupying silence that was different from the silences she'd grown up with. Her father's silences had always contained a threat. This was just space, room to breathe in. "You didn't have to do that," she said after a while. "In the street." "I know. I was handling it. I know that too." He looked at the water. "I moved before I thought about it." She turned to look at him. "Why does Jeremiah know your name?" He was quiet for a beat. She was beginning to understand that his pauses weren't evasion. They were the way he thought, giving words the same weight he gave everything else. "I used to work for a man named Holt Garrity," he said. "Ran a freighting operation out of Denver. Jeremiah Wilson did business with him. I was Garrity's foreman for about 4 years." "Used to," she said. 3 years ago, Garrity started moving things that weren't freight." His voice didn't change, but something in his jaw did. "I found out what it was. I didn't stay after that." She waited. "Jeremiah knew me then," he said, "as Garrity's man. He doesn't know what I did when I left. She sat with that. "What did you do?" Cole looked at the water. The afternoon light was long and gold on it, and somewhere down the creek a bird called twice and stopped. "I made sure Garrity couldn't keep doing it," he said simply. She understood that there was a great deal inside that simple sentence weight she wasn't going to ask him to unpack today. Some things were like her mother's locket, not secret exactly, just not ready to be put into words in the full light of afternoon. "Is that why you're here?" she asked. "Buying land, north of town." He turned to look at her then. There was something in his expression she hadn't seen before. Not surprise exactly. More like the particular look a man got when he realized a woman was paying closer attention than he'd given her credit for. "You hear that?" "I hear most things," she said. He almost smiled. It barely made it to his face, but she caught it. "Yeah," he said. "That's part of why I'm here." "What's the other part?" He looked at her steadily. And Abigail Owens, who had spent 23 years learning to read the small tells in people's faces, the tightening of the eyes, the set of the mouth, the way a person held their breath before they said something true, understood exactly what he did not say. Her pulse did something complicated. She looked back at the water. "My father won't let this go," she said. "Jeremiah's got money, and my father's got debt, and I'm the exchange between them. That doesn't change because I crossed a county line." "No," Cole agreed. "It doesn't." "So what happens now?" "That depends," he said, "on what you want." She looked at him. "What I want." "What you want." His voice was even unhurried. "Not what you're running from, what you're running toward. There's a difference, and it matters." Nobody had ever asked her that before. The question sat in her chest like a lit match, small and bright and slightly dangerous. "I want to not belong to anyone," she said finally. "I want to make my own decisions. I want to build something that's mine." She paused. "I want to stop being afraid." Cole was quiet for a long moment. "That's a good list," he said. She laughed. It came out of nowhere, unexpected even to her, a short, startled sound that surprised both of them. She pressed her hand over her mouth and felt her eyes sting. Cole didn't make anything of it. He just waited until she was done, and then he said, "I'm going to look at that parcel of land tomorrow. North Ridge. You're welcome to come if you want." "Why would I want to do that?" "Because you're building something," he said simply. "Might help to know what the options look like." She looked at him for a long moment. The afternoon light was fading now, going amber and long, and somewhere behind them the town was settling into its evening sounds. "All right," she said. He nodded. He stood up and touched the brim of his hat. 6 in the morning, he said. "Before it gets too hot." He walked back toward town, and Abigail stayed at the creek a little longer, watching the slow water holding her mother's locket through the cloth of her dress, thinking about the particular courage it took to answer an honest question honestly. She had said she wanted to stop being afraid. What she hadn't said, what she was only beginning to admit to herself in the quiet of the low creek and the long golden end of the afternoon, was that for the first time in a very long time, the fear was sharing space with something else, something she didn't have a name for yet. But it was there, warm and new and unmistakable, and it frightened her almost as much as everything else. She almost didn't go. She was up before dawn the way she always was, habit and old anxiety pulling her out of sleep before the sky had color. She sat on the edge of her bed in Mrs. Marner's rooming house, and she argued with herself in the dark, and she almost talked herself out of it 3 separate times. She went anyway. Cole was already at the edge of town when she arrived, the black horse saddled and waiting, and he had a second horse, a dun mare with a calm eye on a lead beside him. He handed her the reins without comment, and they rode north without speaking for the first mile the way they'd traveled the night she'd run easy in the silence between them. The land past the North Ridge was rolling and dry in the summer heat, backed by a line of cottonwoods where a thin creek ran. Cole walked her through it without ceremony. This is where a house would sit. This is the water source. This is the line of the property. He spoke practically about soil and watershed and the cost of lumber, and she listened and asked questions, and he answered them without condescension, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, that a woman would want to understand the practical mechanics of building something on a piece of land. She was standing at the edge of the cottonwoods, looking out at the flat reach of the property, when she said, "You're planning to stay?" "Yes," he said. "This isn't just passing through." "No," he said. "It stopped being that." He paused. "Few days ago." She knew what he meant. She didn't say so. She looked at the land and felt the complicated thing in her chest doing its complicated work, and she thought, "This is not simple." Nothing about this was simple. Not her father on the road behind her. Not Jeremiah's money and his patience. Not this man standing 3 feet away, who had stepped between her and her father's fist, without flinching. "My father will come back," she said. "He meant what he said. I know he did, and Jeremiah won't let the arrangement dissolve quietly. He'll find a legal angle if he can. He has enough money to find one." "Probably," Cole said. She turned to look at him. "You're not worried." "I didn't say that." "You're not showing it." He looked at her steadily. "Showing it doesn't help you," he said. "So I don't show it." She studied his face, the lines of it, the weathered honesty, the careful control that she was beginning to understand was not coldness, but discipline. She thought, "This is a man who has carried very heavy things for a very long time and learned how to carry them without letting them bend him." She knew something about that. "Cole," she said. "Yeah." "When they come back." She stopped, started again. "I'm not going to let them take me, whatever that costs. I need you to know that." He looked at her for a long moment. The breeze moved through the cottonwoods. Somewhere far off, a hawk called. "I know it," he said. She nodded. She turned back to the land. Below them, back down the road, invisible but not forgotten, Cutter's Creek waited. And beyond it, somewhere south, her father and Jeremiah Wilson were doing their own planning in their own quiet. She could feel it. They weren't finished. Not by a long way. Neither was she. They rode back into Cutter's Creek in the late morning, and Abigail knew something was wrong before they reached the main street. She felt it the way she'd always felt her father's mood shifts, not in any one thing she could point to, but in the accumulated texture of small signals. The way 2 men on the boardwalk stopped talking when they saw her coming. The way Mrs. Harlan, the baker's wife, looked at her from across the street, and then looked quickly away. She said nothing to Cole, but she sat straighter in the saddle. Ruth was waiting at the door of the dry goods store, and the look on her face confirmed it. "Inside," Ruth said. "Both of you." Abigail dismounted before the horse fully stopped. Cole was right behind her. Ruth put the closed sign in the window and turned around. She had a folded paper in her hand, thick stock official-looking, with a wax seal on the outside that Abigail didn't recognize. "Sheriff Doyle brought this an hour ago," Ruth said. She held it out. "I told him you were out. He said it didn't matter, it was going to find you one way or the other." Abigail took the paper. She opened it. Her reading wasn't slow. Her mother had made sure of that, had taught her by firelight on winter nights with whatever books she could borrow, and she read through the document once and then again because the first time through she didn't want to believe what it said. "What is it?" Cole asked. She looked up. Her voice came out flat. "Jeremiah filed a civil petition. He's claiming my father entered into a valid betrothal contract on my behalf, and that my leaving constitutes breach of that contract." She looked back at the paper. "He's asking the territorial court to compel my return to my father's custody and enforce the marriage agreement." The room went very quiet. Ruth exhaled through her nose. "That weasel-backed son of a... Can he do that?" Cole asked. "Apparently he's trying." Abigail set the paper on the counter. Her hands were steady. She was furious, and the fury was a clean thing, better than fear, sharper than despair. "He's found himself a lawyer somewhere. Someone who's willing to argue that at 23 I'm still legally bound by a contract my father signed." "That's not how the law works," Ruth said. You're a grown woman. The law works however the man with the most money can make it work, Abigail said. You know that as well as I do. Ruth's jaw tightened. She knew it. They all knew it. Cole picked up the paper and read it. His expression didn't change. She was beginning to understand that this was where he lived in that controlled stillness, and that it wasn't indifference, but the opposite of it. He felt things deeply and had taught himself not to let that depth become a liability. He's filed in Harkin County, Cole said. That's 2 counties east. That's where his lawyer is, probably. You'd need to respond. Contest it. With what? She met his eyes. I have $2.80 and a job that pays me fair but hasn't paid me long. Jeremiah Wilson has been in this territory for 15 years. He knows the judges. He knows the clerks. She stopped, breathed. He planned this. He didn't come to Cutter's Creek to drag me back by force. He came to make a show of it, let the town see it, and then go do this quietly through a courtroom where I have no voice. Cole put the paper down. He looked at her steadily. You have a voice, he said. What you need is someone to stand up in that courtroom and speak it out loud. You mean a lawyer. I mean a lawyer. Cole, I have money, he said. The words landed between them, simply without drama, which somehow made them land harder. Abigail stared at him. I'm not taking your money. I'm not offering charity. I'm offering a loan. He held her gaze. Pay me back when you can. Don't pay me back if you can't. It doesn't change what's right. She wanted to say no. She had been saying no to things her whole life. No to her father, no to Jeremiah, no to every version of a life someone else had designed for her, and the refusal came so naturally now that she almost deployed it automatically. But this wasn't the same. This was a man looking at her and telling her she was worth fighting for, and asking for nothing in return, but the chance to help, and she was so unused to that particular thing that she didn't know what to do with it. I'll think about it, she said. Ruth made a sound that suggested she thought Abigail should think faster. She was behind the counter that afternoon, restocking the salt, when Jeremiah Wilson walked through the front door. He came alone. That was its own kind of statement, that he didn't need the hired men here, that he was confident enough in this particular territory that muscle wasn't required. He wore a clean coat. He carried his hat in his hands, which was meant to look respectful, and didn't. Ruth appeared from the back room like she had a sixth sense for trouble, which Abigail was increasingly certain she did. Mr. Wilson, Ruth said, this is a place of business. You're welcome to make a purchase. I'm here to speak with Miss Owens. He kept his eyes on Abigail. Privately, if she's willing. She's working, Ruth said. Ruth. Abigail put down the salt. It's all right. She looked at Jeremiah. Say what you came to say. He glanced at Ruth. Ruth crossed her arms and did not move 1 inch, which was the clearest possible statement that privately was not happening in her store. Jeremiah read the room and accepted it with a thin smile. Abigail, he said, I want you to understand something. This legal matter, it doesn't have to go the way it's headed. I'm not your enemy. You filed a petition to force me into marriage, she said. I'm not sure what the friendly version of that looks like. I filed a petition to protect a legal agreement. He was patient. She hated how patient he was. Your father and I made an arrangement in good faith. You leaving the way you did put him in a very difficult position. He put himself in a difficult position, she said, the night he started using my future as currency to cover his debts. Something moved across Jeremiah's face. It was quick, a flicker barely there, but she caught it. How much does he owe you? She said. Jeremiah was quiet. He didn't borrow money from you, she said slowly, the pieces arranging themselves. Did he? It's the other way. You owe him something, or you did. She watched his face. What did my father do for you, Jeremiah? What does he know? The patience on his face thinned. Just slightly, just enough. Withdraw the petition, she said. Walk away. Whatever my father has on you, it isn't worth this. You don't know what you're talking about, he said. His voice had lost its smoothness. "Then tell me I'm wrong." He looked at her for a long moment. Something complicated moved through his eyes. She couldn't name it entirely, but underneath the calculation and the frustration and the wounded dignity, there was something that looked improbably like the ghost of a man who knew what he was doing was not right, and had made his peace with that knowledge a long time ago. "Withdraw the petition," she said again quietly. "And we're done. Nobody says anything about anything. You ride out, and this town never sees you again. And if I don't, then I find out what my father is holding over you," she said, "and I use it." He put his hat back on his head. He looked at her the way a man looked at something he'd misjudged. "You're not what I expected," he said. "No," she agreed. "I'm not." He walked out. Ruth waited until the door closed. "What in the Sam Hill was that?" "A guess," Abigail said. Her heart was hammering. "A fairly large guess." "Did you actually see something in his face, or were you bluffing?" "Both," Abigail said. "Mostly the second one." Ruth looked at her for a long moment. Then she started to laugh low and genuine, the laugh of a woman who hadn't seen someone take a swing like that in a long time. Cole found out about the confrontation from Ruth that evening. He came to the rooming house after supper and knocked, which he always did, and Abigail answered and saw the look on his face and let him in. "You told him you'd expose him," Cole said. "Not an accusation. More like a man who was running calculations. I told him I'd find out what my father had on him and use it. Do you know what it is?" "No." He sat down in the chair by the window and looked at the floor for a moment. She could tell he was deciding something. "I might," he said. She sat down across from him. "Explain." He looked up. "When I worked for Garrity, Jeremiah Wilson was one of 3 men who bought passage for certain kinds of cargo across the territorial line into Kansas. Things that weren't legal to move. One of the shipments went wrong. A man died." He paused. "Jeremiah was present when it happened. My guess is your father knows that." She stared at him. "How would my father know that?" "Because Abel Owens drove freight for Garrity twice in the winter of 1879, Cole said. "I didn't know that until I started asking around. He was there for one of the same runs. He saw what Wilson saw." The silence stretched out. Abigail felt the shape of it, the whole ugly architecture of it, settling into place in her mind. Her father hadn't just sold her to pay a debt. He'd sold her because Jeremiah Wilson needed to buy his silence, and Abigail was the price. She was the coin in a transaction between 2 men who had both done something they needed buried. "He used me," she said. Her voice was very quiet. "He used me to protect himself." "Yes," Cole said. She looked at her hands in her lap. She thought about every year she had spent in that house, believing some small, stubborn part of her, that underneath the cruelty there was something that resembled a father. Some thread of it. Something. She let it go now. She felt it leave. It wasn't dramatic, just a slow release like a rope going slack. "I need you to tell me everything you know," she said. "About Garrity. About the shipment. About what happened." "Abigail, everything," she said. "If I'm going to fight this, I need to know what I'm fighting with." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded. He talked for a long time. She listened to all of it. She didn't sleep much. She lay in the dark and turned it over and over, the pieces. The angles, what she had and what she didn't. And by the time the sky went gray at the edges, she had something that wasn't quite a plan, but was close enough to one. She was at Ruth's store before it opened. Ruth let her in without comment and put coffee on. "I need to write a letter," Abigail said. "To the Harkin County Court Clerk. I need to contest the petition formally." "All right, and I need to write a second letter to the Territorial Marshal's office in Helena." Ruth looked at her over the rim of her coffee cup. "About what?" "About Garrity's freighting operation, and the men involved in it." The store was very quiet. Ruth set her cup down. "That's a dangerous piece of paper to put your name on," she said. "I know." "If Wilson finds out you sent it before it gets there." "I know that too." Abigail met her eyes. "Will you help me?" Ruth was quiet for 10 full seconds, which from Ruth was the equivalent of a long conversation. "Get the paper," she said. "I'll get the pen." They were still writing when the front window shattered. The rock that came through it was the size of a fist, and it hit the floor and skidded under the counter, and the sound of the glass was enormous in the early morning quiet. Abigail was on her feet before the shards stopped moving. Ruth already had the shotgun. Outside, through the broken window frame, she could see 3 men on horseback. Not her father. Not Jeremiah. Men she didn't recognize, with the particular look of hired hands doing a job they'd been paid to do and had no personal feeling about. One of them called out, "Miss Owens, Mr. Wilson sends his regards. He says you should think carefully before you send any mail today." Ruth stepped up to the broken window with the shotgun at her shoulder and said in a voice as level as a survey line, "Get off my street before I make a significant mess of your morning." The man in front looked at the shotgun. He looked at Ruth's face. He made the right decision. The horses turned and moved off at a trot. Abigail stood in the glass and breathed. Her heart was going fast, but her mind was clear, the way it had been clear the night she'd gone out the window and started walking north. The way it went clear whenever the situation got bad enough that panic became a luxury she couldn't afford. "They're watching the mail," she said. "Seems like. If I give the letters to the postal clerk, Wilson will know before they reach Helena. Probably has someone there already," Ruth said. She lowered the shotgun. "He's been planning this longer than we thought." The door opened. Cole came in fast. Looked at the glass. Looked at both of them. Looked at the window. "I heard it from down the block," he said. "You all right?" "Fine," Abigail said. She looked at him. "Cole, the letters can't go through the mail." He understood immediately she could see it. "You need a rider. Someone who can get to Helena fast and isn't connected to this town." He was already moving toward the door. "Give me an hour." "Cole?" He stopped. She looked at him. The morning light came in through the broken window and caught the side of his face, and she thought about the night on the road when he'd stepped down from that horse without being asked and offered to walk so she could ride. She thought about the way he'd said a man who uses his hands on a woman isn't a man I have much use for. She thought about the way he'd caught her father's wrist in the street and held it with nothing but his hand and his will. "Thank you," she said. Just that, no qualifiers. He held her eyes for a moment. Something passed between them, not complicated, not dressed up in words. Simple and solid the way the best things were. "1 hour," he said. He walked out. Mom. The hour passed slowly. Ruth swept the glass. Abigail finished the letters and sealed them. The town moved around them in its ordinary way, and the ordinary feel of it was surreal against the tightness in her chest. 40 minutes in the sheriff's office door opened across the street. Sheriff Doyle came out a good man, mostly the sort who tried to do right within the limits of what the job allowed, and walked toward the store with his hat in his hand and an expression that said he was doing something he didn't enjoy. "Miss Owens," he said when he came in. He saw the window. He saw Ruth. He had the look of a man who'd been handed someone else's problem. "I've been asked to inform you that Mr. Wilson's attorney has filed for an emergency hearing. Harkin County Judge is coming here. Day after tomorrow." Abigail looked at him. "Here. Wilson requested it. On account of—" He stopped. "On account of your circumstances." "Your circumstances." "A woman with no money and no lawyer and no time." "Thank you, Sheriff," she said. He nodded. He looked like he wanted to say something else. He looked at the broken window again. He looked at Ruth. "Anything I should know about that window," he said. "Rock came through it," Ruth said pleasantly. "Darndest thing. Haven't the faintest idea who'd do such a thing." Doyle looked at her for a moment. "I'll ask around," he said with the tone of a man who would ask around and probably not find anything. He left. Abigail sat down on the stool behind the counter and put her hands flat on the countertop to stop them from shaking. 2 days. She had 2 days before a judge arrived. A judge Jeremiah Wilson had likely already spoken to in a territory where money and connections moved faster than justice. 2 days to get those letters to Helena and get a response back, which was almost certainly not enough time. 2 days to find something, anything that would hold up in front of a court of law against a man who had spent 15 years learning how courts worked in his favor. She heard Cole's voice before she heard his boots. He was talking to someone outside Low Quick Exchange, and then the door opened and he came in. "I found someone," he said. "He's good. He can ride straight through. He's willing. He owes me a favor." He came to the counter and looked at her face. "What happened?" "Hearing's been called. Day after tomorrow. A judge is coming here." Cole went very still. Wilson moved fast. "He has money and he's scared." She looked up at him. "Cole, if that hearing goes forward without a lawyer, without the marshal's office involved, without anything, he wins. He doesn't even have to fight hard. He just has to show up with his paperwork and his lawyer and his version of who I am." "I know," Cole said. "And you and I both know that the letter might not reach Helena in time, even if your rider goes straight through." "I know that too." She looked at him. "There's another way." He waited. "What you know about Garrity's operation," she said. "About Jeremiah being present when that man died. If you testified to that in that hearing in front of that judge, it'd blow the whole case open," he said. "Yes." He was quiet. She understood what she was asking. She understood that what Cole Zachary knew about Garrity's operation was information he'd been carrying quietly for 3 years. Information that had cost him a job, and probably cost him more than that information he'd chosen to use in one specific way and then put away. She was asking him to put it on the table, in public, in front of a judge, with his name on it. "Cole," she said, "you don't have to." "I'll do it," he said. "I haven't finished." "I know what you were going to say," he said, "and I'll do it." She looked at him. He looked back. She thought about what he'd told her the night at the creek, about the person he'd known, the one nobody had helped, the reason he was still sorry. She thought she understood now what that person had meant to him. She thought she understood what he was carrying, and had been carrying, and why standing still in the face of injustice was the one thing Cole Zachary was constitutionally incapable of doing. She wanted to say something that matched the weight of what he was offering. She couldn't find the words for it. "Okay," she said. He nodded. "Day after tomorrow," he said. "Get some rest." She almost laughed. "I don't think I'm going to sleep much." "I know," he said, "but try." He left. She listened to his boots on the boardwalk fading toward the end of the street. She looked at the broken window. She looked at the sealed letters on the counter. She thought about her father somewhere south of here, sleeping soundly, certain the machinery he'd set in motion was going to grind everything back into the shape he wanted. She picked up the letters. She held them. Day after tomorrow, she thought. She was going to be ready. She didn't sleep. She'd told Cole she would try, and she had lied. Or rather, she had meant it when she said it, and then spent the night sitting on the edge of her bed with her mother's locket in her palm, turning it over and over in the dark, the way she turned problems over in her mind, looking for the angle, the weak point, the place where something solid might hold. By the time the sky went pale, she had run through every version of the next day she could imagine. Most of them ended badly. A few of them ended worse than that. She got up. She washed her face. She put on the cleanest dress she had, the blue one, which Ruth had pressed for her the evening before, without being asked, laying it folded on the counter with the wordless practicality that was Ruth's particular form of love. She braided her hair the way her mother had taught her, tight and clean, because there was a version of herself she intended to present to that courtroom, and she was going to present every inch of it. She picked up the locket. She clasped it around her neck for the first time since she'd left home. She let it settle against her collarbone and thought, "Mama, I could use some of whatever you had." Then she walked downstairs and out into the morning. The hearing was held in Sheriff Doyle's office, which was the largest official space in Cutter's Creek, which was not large at all. By 8 in the morning, it was already packed townspeople standing along the walls, the air thick with summer heat, and the particular collective tension of a small community watching something consequential happen inside it. Judge Harold Fenner had ridden in from Harkin County the previous evening, and Abigail had seen him briefly, a lean, gray-haired man in his 60s, with the bearing of someone who'd sat behind a lot of benches and heard a lot of arguments and had strong opinions about wasted time. She couldn't read him. That scared her more than almost anything else. Jeremiah's lawyer was a man named Aldous Prentice, soft-handed, well-dressed, with the professional ease of a man who'd spent decades making bad situations sound inevitable. He had a leather case full of documents, and the particular confidence of someone who had been told this was already won. Abigail sat at the small table across from him, with her hands flat on the surface and her back straight, and nothing in front of her but the 2 letters she'd written, and a folded piece of paper Cole had given her that morning, without explanation, saying only, "Read it when you need it." Ruth sat in the front row of townspeople behind her. She had not brought the shotgun, which Abigail considered a small mercy. Cole was not in the room. She had noticed that immediately and did not let herself react to it. She told herself he had a reason. She almost believed it. Judge Fenner called the proceeding to order with the flat efficiency of a man who did not enjoy ceremony. This is an informal hearing on a civil petition filed by Mr. Jeremiah Wilson regarding a betrothal agreement. Miss Owens is present as respondent. Mr. Prentice, you may begin. Prentice stood up. He had a good voice, calm, authoritative, with the cadence of a man who understood that half of persuasion was simply sounding like you'd already won. Your Honor, the matter is straightforward. In March of this year, Mr. Abel Owens entered into a formal betrothal agreement with my client, Mr. Jeremiah Wilson, on behalf of his daughter, Miss Abigail Owens, then a resident of his household and a dependent under his care and provision. Miss Owens's subsequent departure from her father's home constitutes a breach of that agreement. We are asking the court to recognize the validity of the contract and order Miss Owens to honor its terms. Judge Fenner looked at Abigail. Miss Owens, you're representing yourself. Yes, Your Honor. Prentice made a small sound, not quite a laugh, but adjacent to one. You have a response to the petition, the judge said. Abigail stood. Yes, Your Honor, I do. She kept her voice level. I am 23 years old. I have been employed and self-supporting for the past week. I did not sign the agreement Mr. Prentice is referring to, and I was not consulted when it was made. My father does not have the legal authority to bind me to a contract without my consent. She was living in his household, Prentice said, dependent on his provision. Territorial precedent. Territorial precedent applies to minors, Abigail said. I am not a minor, and I have not been dependent on my father's provision for the past week. I earn wages. I pay for my own lodging. I am a free woman of legal age, and I did not agree to marry Jeremiah Wilson. Your Honor, Prentice said smoothly, Miss Owens's recent employment was obtained only after she fled her father's home in violation of the agreement. You cannot break a contract and then use the consequences of breaking it as your defense. The room was very quiet. Judge Fenner looked at Abigail. She had prepared for this moment. She knew what she'd planned to say, the legal argument about consent, about the limits of paternal authority over adult children, about the precedent from a case in Kansas 3 years prior that Ruth had known about and written down for her. She had it all ready. Then the door to the sheriff's office opened, and everything changed. Abel Owens walked in. He hadn't been there at the start of the hearing, and his arrival now mid-proceeding without announcement moving through the crowd, with that particular mass and certainty, sent a visible ripple through the room. He put himself against the wall near the door, with his arms crossed, and he looked at his daughter with the expression she had seen 1,000 times, patient, certain, already decided. Beside her, she felt the room shift in his favor. She felt it the way you felt, weather changing, a drop in pressure, a collective leaning. She looked at him. She did not look away first. We may continue, Judge Fenner said. Prentice pressed his advantage. He produced documents. The original betrothal agreement, her father's signature on it, a statement from Abel Owens, asserting his daughter's dependency, a letter from the reverend of their home parish attesting to the long-standing nature of the arrangement. He laid them out one by one, with the unhurried precision of a man building a wall. Abigail answered each one. She kept her voice even. She cited precedent. She cited her own financial independence. She was not without resources. Ruth had helped her prepare, and Cole had helped her the evening before, and she made her arguments clearly and without flinching. But she could feel the weight of Prentice's case. It was substantial. It was built on paper she couldn't see until he produced it. Then Prentice said, "Your Honor, we'd like to call Mr. Abel Owens as a corroborating witness." Fenner nodded. Abel came forward. He was good at this part. He always had been the controlled performance of a reasonable man, the measured voice, the sorrowful expression. He described his daughter as confused, as impressionable, as a young woman who'd been taken advantage of by people in this town, who didn't understand the obligations of family. He described Jeremiah Wilson as a good man, a patient man, a man who'd waited through all of this with more grace than could be expected. He never once raised his voice. He never once looked anything but grieved. Abigail sat across from him and watched it happen and felt the cold knowledge of how good he was at this, how many years he had spent perfecting it. The jury of the room was shifting. She could feel it. Even people who had seen the bruise on her face were being made to feel uncertain by the particular quality of his performance. Fenner looked at her. "Miss Owens, you may question the witness." She stood. She looked at her father. She thought about the folded paper Cole had given her. Read it when you need it. She didn't know what was in it. She hadn't opened it. She reached for it now on the table. She unfolded it. She read it. For a moment, she couldn't breathe. It was a signed statement dated 2 days prior from a man named George Tullis of Billings, Montana. It was 3 paragraphs long. In it, George Tullis stated that in the winter of 1879, he had witnessed Abel Owens receive a cash payment from Jeremiah Wilson in exchange for Abel Owens's silence regarding a death that had occurred during a freight transfer outside of Garrity's operation. The payment was $340. George Tullis had kept this information for 3 years because he was afraid of both men. He was less afraid now, he wrote, because Cole Zachary had asked him to be brave enough to write it down. $340. She thought about the $3.40 she had saved over 2 years coin by coin in a floorboard beneath her bed. She thought about the man who had told her she was eating his food and wearing clothes he'd paid for. She thought about all the ways a person could be both a victim and a perpetrator, and all the ways those things could exist inside the same human being at the same time. She folded the paper. She looked at her father. "Do you know a man named George Tullis?" she said. The room was absolutely still. Her father's face didn't change. That was how she knew he knew the name. Innocent men reacted denial, confusion, the natural movement of a person encountering something unexpected. He went very still instead, the way a man went still when he was deciding which direction to run. "I've known a lot of men," he said carefully. "George Tullis of Billings," she said. "Winter of 1879. Does that narrow it down?" His jaw tightened. 1 degree. Almost imperceptible. "I don't know what you're implying." "I'm not implying anything." She held up the paper. "I'm asking a direct question. Do you know George Tullis?" Prentice stood up. "Your Honor, I fail to see the relevance." "The relevance," Abigail said, keeping her eyes on her father, "is that Mr. Wilson's arrangement with my father was not a legal agreement made in good faith between 2 parties. It was a transaction. My father received money from Jeremiah Wilson, not because Mr. Wilson wanted to marry me, because my father had information about Mr. Wilson that could put him in front of a territorial marshal, and I was the price of his silence." The room erupted. It was not a clean moment. It was not a moment that played out the way she had imagined it in the dark of the previous night, when it had seemed simple and clear and decisive. Real moments were never that. Real moments were noise and competing voices, and Judge Fenner banging on the desk for order, and Prentice talking over everyone, and Abel Owens's face going through a series of expressions she had never seen on it before. But Fenner got the room quiet. He was a man who knew how to get rooms quiet. He looked at the statement. He read it. He read it twice. His expression gave nothing away, but when he set it down, he looked at Prentice and then at Jeremiah Wilson, who had been sitting in the second row and had gone the color of old chalk, and then he said, "Mr. Prentice, I'd like to hear your response to this document before we go any further." Prentice tried. He was good at his job, and he tried hard. He questioned the provenance of the statement, questioned the credibility of a man who'd sat on information for 3 years, questioned the connection between the payment described and the betrothal agreement. He was thorough and professional, and it didn't matter because the damage was done in the place that mattered most in the room, in the court of the people sitting along the walls, watching in the faces of the men and women of Cutter's Creek who had seen the bruise on Abigail Owens's face and had now heard the words, transaction, and price of his silence, and could not unhear them. And then the door opened again. This time it was Cole. He was not alone. Behind him was a young man Abigail didn't recognize, trail dusty, clearly having ridden through the night, and behind that man was a woman in her 40s in a marshal's deputy badge that caught the light as she walked in. The room went so quiet you could have heard a thread drop. The deputy's name was Margaret Voss. She introduced herself to Judge Fenner in the crisp, direct way of a person who had said her name in front of a lot of rooms and expected it to mean something. She said, received a letter 2 days prior regarding matters pertaining to the Garrity freighting operation in Denver. She had ridden through the night as a precautionary measure because the names in the letter were names she recognized from an ongoing investigation. She had papers of her own. She placed them in front of Judge Fenner. He read them for a long time. The room waited. Outside somewhere, a horse nickered, and someone on the boardwalk laughed at something, and the ordinary sound of it was almost surreal inside the suffocating tension of the sheriff's office. Fenner set the papers down. He looked at Jeremiah Wilson. Jeremiah Wilson stood up. He didn't wait to be addressed. He looked at Abel Owens across the room, and the look between them was ancient and ugly and final. 2 men watching the thing they'd built together collapse. And then Jeremiah looked at Abigail, and he said very quietly, "I withdraw the petition." Prentice started to say something. Jeremiah held up one hand and Prentice stopped. "I withdraw the petition," Jeremiah said again to Judge Fenner this time. Unconditionally. Fenner looked at him for a long moment. "The court accepts the withdrawal. The petition is dismissed." He picked up his papers. He looked at Deputy Voss. "I expect you'll be having further conversations with the parties involved." "Yes, Your Honor," she said. "I will." He stood up. He walked out, just like that. As if it were simple, which it hadn't been, and everyone in the room knew it. The room took a long time to empty. People didn't want to leave. Abigail understood it. Something real had happened here, and people wanted to stay close to it to carry it home with them to tell it. She stood at the table with the papers in her hands and let the room empty around her. Ruth came to her first. She put her hand on Abigail's shoulder and squeezed once and said nothing, which from Ruth was the most. Then Cole. He came through the thinning crowd and stopped in front of her and looked at her face with that careful, unhurried attention he gave to things that mattered. "You all right?" he said. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "Give me a minute." He gave her a minute. He stood there while she assembled the pieces of herself, the parts that were shaking, the parts that were strangely calm, the part that was standing very still in the center of all of it, trying to understand that it was over, or at least this part of it was. "George Tullis," she said. "He agreed to sign the statement 2 days ago," Cole said. He'd wanted to do something for a long time and hadn't known how. "When I told him what Wilson was doing, how did you find him?" "I'd been looking for him since I came to Cutter's Creek," he said. "He was one of the men I knew could corroborate what happened in '79. He's been in Billings for the past 2 years. I sent word when I realized what Wilson was planning." She looked at him. "You came to Cutter's Creek because of Wilson." "I came because of Wilson," he said, "and because of what he and Garrity and men like them do to people who can't protect themselves. And then you found me in the road." "And then I found you in the road." She was quiet for a moment. The room was almost empty now. Through the open door she could see the deputy talking to Sheriff Doyle in the street. She could see her father not close, not near, standing by his horse with the hired men and not looking at her. He hadn't spoken to her since the hearing broke up. She didn't know if he would. She didn't know what she felt about her father right now. It was too large and too complicated to touch. It was a thing she would have to come back to. "What happens to him?" she said. "My father." Cole was quiet for a moment. "That depends on what the deputy finds and what charges she brings. The payment from Wilson is established. If they can connect him to the freight operation directly, it could be serious. He might go to prison." "He might?" She looked down at the table. She thought about a small girl sitting at a kitchen table, learning to read by firelight. She thought about a woman who hummed while she cooked to keep a secret song alive. She thought about the 9 years of silence after. "He made his choices," she said. Her voice was steady. "I made mine." "Yes," Cole said. She picked up her letters. She picked up George Tullis's statement. She picked up the folded paper Cole had given her, and she held it for a moment. "You planned this," she said. "Not just the statement, all of it." "I prepared for it," he said. "There's a difference." "What's the difference?" He almost smiled, that barely there expression she'd come to watch for. "Preparing means you're ready for what happens. Planning means you think you know. I've been wrong enough times to know I don't." She looked at him. She looked at the careful honesty of his face, the worn patience of it, the thing underneath it that she'd been quietly naming to herself for days without saying it out loud. "Cole?" she said. "Yeah." "Why did you really stay in Cutter's Creek?" The question sat between them. He'd almost answered it before at the creek when he'd said it stopped being that few days ago and let the implication stand without completing it. She was completing it now. She was asking him to say the thing she already knew and had been circling like a woman who wasn't sure the ground would hold if she stepped on it. He looked at her for a long time. "You know why," he said. "I want to hear it." He took a breath. "Let it out." He had the look of a man picking up something heavy and choosing to carry it in the open instead of hiding it. "Because you stood up in that road in the middle of the night," he said, "and told me your name like it was something worth saying, and I couldn't get it out of my head after that." The room was empty now. Just the two of them in the heat and the quiet. She looked at him. She thought about all the things she'd been told she was her father's property. Jeremiah's purchased quiet a burden and a bargaining chip, and a girl who didn't know what was good for her. She thought about standing in the street and saying, or what to the man who had hit her since she was 14 years old. She thought about what she'd told Cole at the creek. "I want to stop being afraid." She thought about the warmth she'd felt then, that unnamed thing she hadn't let herself name. She had a name for it now. "I'm still figuring out who I am," she said. "Outside of all this, I don't know yet who I am when there isn't someone telling me who I'm supposed to be." "I know," he said. "I'm not asking you to know." "Then what are you asking?" He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the deputy was still talking to Doyle. The street was going back to its ordinary business the way streets did. "I'm asking if I can be around while you figure it out," he said. She looked at him. She felt the ground beneath her uncertain, knew nothing, like the packed and punishing earth of her father's yard. This ground was different. It wasn't soft, it wasn't easy, but it was honest, and it was hers to stand on. "Yes," she said. He didn't smile. He didn't reach for her. He just nodded once, slow and certain, the way he did everything, like a man who understood that the things worth having were worth treating carefully. "All right then," he said. She picked up her things. She walked to the door. She stopped in the frame of it and looked out at Cutter's Creek, the street, the people, the wide, bright Montana sky pressing down on everything, and she thought, this is the day things changed. Not the day she ran. Not the day she arrived. This day. This morning in the heat and the noise and the extraordinary, ordinary aftermath of something hard that she had survived. She stepped out into it. Behind her she heard Cole follow, and her father's horse at the far end of the street turned south, and she didn't watch it go. The week after the hearing was the strangest of Abigail's life. Stranger even than the night she'd climbed out the window and started walking north with $3.40 and no plan. That night had been fear and momentum, one foot in front of the other, no room to think. This week was the opposite. The danger had moved back. The noise had settled, and she was left standing in the sudden quiet of a life that was actually impossibly hers. She didn't know what to do with quiet. She never had. She threw herself into Ruth's store the way she'd thrown herself into every difficult thing with her whole body and all her concentration, moving inventory and learning accounts, and staying until the light failed every evening, because staying busy kept her from sitting still long enough to feel the full weight of everything that had happened. Ruth watched her do it and said nothing for 3 days, which meant Ruth understood because Ruth always understood more than she let on. On the 4th day, Ruth said, "You're allowed to stop running, you know, even when there's nothing chasing you anymore." Abigail looked up from the ledger. "I'm not running. I'm working." "You've reorganized the salt shelf 4 times this week." Abigail looked at the salt shelf. She had. Ruth sat down across from her at the counter and folded her hands on the surface the way she did when she was about to say something she'd been holding for a while. "He's been out at that property every day," she said. "Cole, from sunup to sundown, near as I can tell. Jim Heller says he's already started clearing the site for a house." Abigail said nothing. "He hasn't pushed you," Ruth said. "I want you to notice that." "I notice it." "Good. Notice it out loud once in a while. It matters a man like that." Abigail closed the ledger. She thought about what Cole had said in the empty sheriff's office. "I'm asking if I can be around while you figure it out," and the way he'd meant it, which was exactly what he said, and nothing more. No claim, no condition, just presence, offered the way he offered everything plainly without drama, take it or leave it. She had spent 23 years in a house where every offer had a hidden cost. She was still learning what it felt like when there wasn't one. "Ruth," she said. When you built this store, when you started it before you knew if it would work, were you afraid?" Ruth was quiet for a moment. "Every single day for the first 2 years," she said. "And then one morning I woke up and I wasn't, and I didn't even know exactly when it had changed. It just had." Abigail looked at her hands on the counter. "How do you know when you're ready to build something?" Ruth looked at her with the patient precision of a woman who had seen a great many people ask questions they already knew the answer to. "You don't," she said. "You start anyway. That's the whole thing, Abigail. That's all there is to it." She rode out to the North Ridge the next morning. She didn't send word first. She didn't plan what she would say. She just saddled the dun mare, which Ruth had quietly arranged for her to use whenever she needed it, another wordless gift, and she rode north until she heard the sound of an axe working wood and followed it. Cole had his coat off. He was working on clearing the foundation site, moving with the focused economy of a man who understood physical labor as something useful rather than punishing. He heard the horse and turned around, and when he saw her, he stopped and set the axe down and waited. She dismounted. She walked to where he stood. She looked at the site, the cleared earth, the staked corners of what would be a house, the cottonwoods at the edge of the property moving in the morning heat. She looked at the dimensions of it the way he'd laid it out, and she thought, he built this big. Bigger than one man needed. She didn't say that. She looked at it and felt what she felt and stood with it for a moment. "You're making progress," she said. "Slowly," he said. "Slow is fine." She paused. "As long as it's solid." He looked at her. He understood what she was saying. She could tell from the way he went still, that particular stillness that meant he was taking something seriously. "It'll be solid," he said. She looked at him directly. "Cole, I'm not a woman who needs saving. I want to be clear about that. I know you're not, and I'm not going to come to you with my hand out every time something goes wrong. I'm going to work, and I'm going to build what I told you I wanted to build, something that's mine, and I'm not going to apologize for being difficult while I figure out how to do it." "I wouldn't ask you to," he said. "I'm still angry," she said. "About my father. About all of it. That's going to take time. I've got time." She stopped. She looked at him. The space between them was small and charged with something that had been building for weeks through the midnight road and the creek and the sheriff's office, and all the ordinary and extraordinary moments between. "I don't entirely know who I am yet," she said. "Outside of survival, outside of fighting. I've been doing one or the other my whole life, and I don't know what I am when I'm not doing either one of them." Cole took one step toward her. He didn't close the distance. He just narrowed it enough that she could see the full detail of his face. "I know what you are," he said quietly. "What's that?" "Someone worth knowing," he said. "For the long term." She felt it hit her somewhere below all the armor. She didn't look away. She held his gaze and let herself feel it. Really feel it without the wall she'd built around everything that was soft and hopeful in her, because that wall had been necessary for a long time. But she was beginning to understand that you couldn't live behind one forever. "All right," she said. He nodded once, slow, the way he agreed to things that mattered. "All right," he said back. 2 weeks later the letter came. It arrived from Helena from Deputy Voss's office, and Abigail read it standing behind Ruth's counter with her coffee going cold beside her. Jeremiah Wilson had been formally charged with his involvement in the Garrity freight operation and the death that had occurred in 1879. He had retained lawyers and would fight it as men with money always did, but the charges were real and the evidence was solid, and Deputy Voss had written with the measured satisfaction of a woman who had been building toward something for a long time. Abel Owens was named as a material witness. He had not been charged, not yet, but he had been summoned to Helena, and the summons had enough teeth in it that he had apparently gone without much argument. Abigail folded the letter. She put it in her apron pocket. She stood at the counter and let the information move through her, all the ways it changed things and all the ways it didn't. Her father in Helena sitting in front of a territorial court accounting for himself. She'd spent years imagining what justice for him might look like. Now that something resembling it was actually happening, it felt less satisfying than she'd thought it would. Not empty, not that, just complicated. The way every true thing was complicated when you were close enough to it to feel all its edges. The bell above the door rang, and she looked up. The man who came in was a stranger to her, middle-aged, trail-dusty, with the look of someone who'd ridden a long way and was looking for something specific. He scanned the store and found her face, and something in his expression shifted. "You're Abigail Owens," he said. Her hand moved to the edge of the counter. "Who's asking?" "My name's Caldwell, Thomas Caldwell. I'm an attorney out of Denver." He reached into his coat and produced a card which he set on the counter. "I've been retained by a party in connection with the Garrity case. I was told I might find you here." "You were told correctly." She didn't pick up the card. "What do you want?" "I want to talk to you about your options," he said, "specifically as they relate to the betrothal contract that's been dismissed." He glanced around the store, not nervously professionally. "There may be civil damages available to you, Miss Owens. Against Wilson, against the estate of the contract. Your father entered into an agreement using your person as collateral without your consent. In certain territories that constitutes actionable harm." She looked at him for a long moment. "You're saying I could sue them," she said. "I'm saying a court might find in your favor," he said carefully. "It would not be simple or fast, but you would not be the first woman to pursue such a claim, and you would have the advantage of a recently dismissed petition, documented evidence of coercion, and a witness whose statement is already entered into the territorial record." She picked up the card. She turned it over in her fingers. She thought about $3.40 in a floorboard. She thought about the cornbread she'd swept off the kitchen floor. She thought about what Cole had said on the North Ridge. It'll be solid, and the particular quality of that word. Solid. Built right. Made to last. "I'll think about it," she said. He nodded. He was professional enough not to push. He left a second document on the counter, a preliminary outline of the claim, and he tipped his hat and left. Ruth appeared from the back room approximately 4 seconds later, which confirmed she had been listening to the entire conversation. "Well," Ruth said, "I need to talk to Cole," Abigail said. She found him at the property where she always found him in the late afternoon. He listened to everything she said without interrupting the way he always did, giving her words the same weight he gave the rest of the world. When she finished, he said, "What do you want to do?" "I want to fight it," she said. "The civil claim. Not because I think it'll be easy. Because it's right." She looked at him. "But it'll take time. Months, maybe longer. And I'll need to stay in Cutter's Creek working for Ruth for as long as it takes. I can't make any—" She stopped. "I can't make promises about what comes after until the after is actually here." He looked at her steadily. "I'm not going anywhere, Abigail." "Coal? I bought 40 acres, he said. "I've been sleeping on the ground for 2 weeks clearing it. I'm not in a hurry." The corner of his mouth moved. "I've got a house to build." She exhaled. Something released in her chest. "You're infuriating," she said. "I've been told." "Who told you?" "You. Several times. In various ways." She almost smiled. He saw it. He didn't make anything of it, just held it quietly in his eyes. She looked at the staked corners of the foundation, the cleared earth, the line of cottonwoods. She thought about what Ruth had said, "You start anyway. That's the whole thing." She thought about the night she'd stepped across Mrs. Marner's threshold and said, "I've come a long way, and I need a room, and I can pay." The particular courage of saying what you needed out loud to someone who might say no and meaning it anyway. "Can I help?" she said. "With the house, when I'm not working, on weekends." He looked at her. "You know how to build?" "No," she said. "But I told you. I can learn." The smile made it to his face this time, all the way full and unhurried. And it changed his face entirely. Took 10 years off. It made him look like the man he must have been before whatever south of here had put all those careful lines in him. It lasted only a moment, but she saw it. "Yeah," he said. "You can." The civil claim took 4 months. It was not clean or simple, or satisfying in any of the ways she'd hoped it would be, and there were days in the middle of it when she sat in Ruth's back room with the documents spread across the table and felt the particular exhaustion of a fight that kept going after she'd already thought she'd won. Thomas Caldwell was thorough and honest about the odds, which she respected, even when she didn't like what he told her. Jeremiah's lawyers were skilled and relentless. There were 2 hearings, a deposition, and a period of 3 weeks, in which nothing seemed to move at all, during which Abigail reorganized Ruth's entire inventory system and learned to build a window frame from coal on Sunday afternoons, and did not even once let herself believe it wasn't going to work. She had stopped being a person who gave up on herself somewhere between the kitchen floor and the midnight road and the creek and the sheriff's office. She didn't know the exact moment. She only knew that the capacity for it, the old instinct to shrink, to absorb, to accept what someone stronger decided for her, was simply gone. Like a tooth that had been aching for years, and finally, one day, didn't hurt anymore. She reached for the familiar shape of it sometimes, and found the absence, and the absence felt like breathing. The ruling came on a Thursday morning in late October, when the heat had finally broken, and the air in Cutter's Creek was something you could stand to breathe without effort. The court found in her favor, not on everything Caldwell had been honest about, that told her the full judgment was unlikely, but on the central claim that the betrothal contract had been entered into without her consent and constituted a civil wrong for which she was owed remedy. The damages were modest by the standards of men like Jeremiah Wilson, significant by any standard she'd ever lived by. It wasn't a fortune, it was a foundation. She stood outside the sheriff's office after it had become a place of some significance in her life, that building, and she held the judgment in her hands and felt it. Not triumph. Something quieter than triumph. Something that felt like standing on ground that was finally, for the first time, completely hers. Ruth was beside her. Cole was on her other side, and he'd come from the property with sawdust on his coat and hadn't bothered to brush it off, which meant he'd ridden in fast when word reached him. "You did that," Ruth said, quietly, plainly. "We did it," Abigail said. "Don't be modest. It doesn't suit you." Abigail laughed. It came out easy, not the startled sound from the creek months ago, but something fuller, something that had room in it. She pressed her hand over her mouth and felt her eyes sting and didn't apologize for either one. Cole put his hand on her shoulder. Just that. Solid and warm and unhurried. She reached up and put her hand over his. The house on the North Ridge was finished in the early spring of the following year, framed and roofed and chinked against the wind, with a front door that faced east and a kitchen window that caught the morning light. Abigail had helped build the window frames and the porch steps and had gotten it wrong the first time and right the second, and the porch steps were consequently slightly uneven on one side, which she considered the most honest thing about the whole structure. She moved her things from Mrs. Marner's rooming house on a Saturday in March, which was a short process, because she had never accumulated much. She stood in the middle of the main room with her mother's locket around her neck and the judgment papers in the cedar box she'd bought with her own wages, and she looked at the morning light coming through the east window. Her window, the one she'd built wrong and then right, and she breathed. Cole came to stand beside her. He was quiet in the way she'd come to love. Not empty quiet, not dangerous quiet, but the kind that made room for things. "What are you thinking?" he said. "That it's strange," she said. "Standing somewhere and knowing you're going to stay. Strange good or strange frightening." She thought about it honestly, the way she tried to do everything now. "Both," she said. "And then mostly good." He nodded. He reached out and took her hand, and she let him, and they stood in the light from the east window for a while without speaking. She thought about a small girl learning to read by firelight, and a woman who hummed to keep a song alive, and 9 years of silence after. She thought about a midnight road, and a man who stepped down from his horse so she could ride. She thought about standing in a street and saying, or what to the biggest force she'd ever known, and the ground holding underneath her when she did. She thought about what it cost to know your own worth when no one had ever once shown you what it was. She thought about the fact that you could spend a lifetime being told you were nothing, told it with words, told it with fists, told it with every decision made over your head and without your voice, and still somewhere inside yourself hold on to the knowledge that it wasn't true. That stubborn buried knowledge. That refusal. She had built this house with her hands. She had fought for her name in a courtroom and won. She had walked out of a life that was killing her and made a new one from nothing but courage and $2.80 and the willingness to say what she needed out loud to people who might help her. Nobody had given her that. No man, no judgment, no court ruling. She had made it. She had decided the night she made herself that promise with her lip bleeding and the taste of copper in her mouth that she was going to live like she was worth something. And then she had gone out and proved it. "Cole," she said. "Yeah." She turned to look at him, at the honest, weathered face of him, the patience that had never once felt like condescension, the man who had asked what she wanted before he offered anything, and then stood beside her and meant it. "I love you," she said, simply, the way she'd learned to say every true thing plainly without armor, because armor was heavy, and she was done carrying more than she needed to. He looked at her. Something moved through his face, not surprise deeper than that, the particular expression of a man who had been careful with himself for a long time and had just been handed a reason not to be. "I love you back," he said. "Have for a while." She nodded. She turned back to the window. Outside, the spring light was long and clean on the 40 acres that were theirs, and the cottonwoods at the creek were beginning to go green at the edges. And somewhere beyond the ridge, the territory stretched out wide and unhurried, toward a horizon that belonged to no one and everyone. She had come a long way. Through the midnight, and the fear, and the courtroom, and the grief, and the strange hard work of becoming the person she had always underneath everything already been. A woman who knew her own worth did not wait for someone else to measure it. She did not kneel for a man who had never earned her respect. She did not stay inside a life that was too small, because leaving felt dangerous, because staying was more dangerous still in all the ways that didn't show bruises. She walked out, and she kept walking, and she built something solid, something real, something that would stand. And she never once looked back.